So this talk is going to be about knowledge gaps and priorities for monitoring and research. We discussed some of this in the Abora workshop, and we're bringing together some of our thoughts here. As I showed before, this is a plan view of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, showing the ridge axis with the thick black line and some of the offsets in that, where there are fracture zones. And it shows probably what we know now about the ridge axis and the habitats along it, mainly that there are some active vent sites, and we suggested some or all of these should be given a protective buffer around them in the Abora workshop. And around these, there are some known inactive vent sites, but we really don't know very much more at the moment. So our plan is to get from the previous slide to this slide, where we have much more information about additional active and inactive vent sites and some of these other areas, such as areas of sponge or coral or other VME type criteria. In addition to that, we really don't know very much at all about inactive vent faunas. And this would be a good area for further research because these are likely to be areas that are going to be mined. We need a knowledge of faunas in fracture zones, which we are intending to protect a few of, and because these are areas where deep water flows from one basin of the Atlantic to another. We need a knowledge of how the ecosystems might recover after mining and after any other disturbance. We need a knowledge of the subsurface pathways of fluid flow between active and inactive vents, because it's possible that the mining of an inactive vent could actually affect the fluid flow to the nearby active vent. This is going to be a challenge for the geologists. And we need to know about connectivity to look at cumulative impacts, and particularly connectivity of organisms that live at different depths along the ridge axis, connectivity between the ridge axis and the continental margins at similar water depths, and connectivity along the ridge axis itself. Going back to my other slide that I had in my first talk a couple of days ago, you can see here some examples of potential mining and the impacts of plumes. So we have some questions about plumes. We really don't know whether the mining plume is going to have the same composition in terms of particulate content and toxins as the hydrothermal plume, whether it could be treated the same or whether it may or may not have the same sort of impact. We then need to know the sensitivity of each habitat to this mining plume, including short-term effects and the chronic long-term effects of potentially years of mining in one place. And those effects may be different, for example, between hydrothermal vent communities and other VME type communities such as corals and sponges. In the midwater, we really know very little at all, and key knowledge gaps are just understanding the faunas themselves, understanding plume impacts on these midwater faunas, again in the short term and the long term, because some animals here will swim in and out of the plume area, and others will passively drift with it, potentially for much longer periods. We don't even know what the plume composition is going to be, what the level of particulates will be, and the level of any toxins. And we don't know how these plumes are going to be dispersed in different oceanographic scenarios of different currents, for example. We also need to consider the transshipment plume, where the ore is transferred from the support vessel to the barges, which may come every few days or week to pick up the ore. It may need to be transported in a wet state, and that water may need to be put back into the ocean. Our recommendation would be that that should be put back with the returned water from the main riser pipe. Other knowledge gaps include the impact of noise, and this could be from the mining vehicle itself, from pumps along the riser pipe, which will probably occur about every kilometre, and particularly one at about 1 kilometre water depth where it could occur in the SOFAR layer, which is a long distance communication channel for whales, and from the surface operations itself, because the ship could actually be very noisy and located in one position for a very long time. Impacts of light could also be considered. from the mining operations on the seabed itself, where a number of bioluminescent organisms live and could be, their bioluminescence could be heavily impacted by strong lights from the mining vehicles. And on surface vessels, where we know in the North Sea there can be impacts on migratory birds or on aggregating other local birds. And there could also be impacts on plankton, which migrate diurnally in the water column. In Evora, we discussed a number of potential engineering solutions that these problems, and we looked at the creation of a minimum, how to minimize the creation of a seabed plume through good engineering design. And I know of some manufacturers that are thinking of putting a sheath around the mining vehicle at the seabed and incorporating all of the plume in that cowl-like sheath and taking it up to the support vessel. We could try to minimize the volume of returned water from the vessel, and you can see in the picture here, not using a riser pipe, but using a form of buckets, which may cause a lot less returned water to be taken to the surface. We could minimize the particle content in the returned water plume, and the returned water could be treated to take many of the toxins out, as happens in other industries, such as the oil industry. It may be possible to minimize the need to lift the ore with some form of seabed processing, and it should be possible to avoid noise in the SOPAR layer and reduce noise elsewhere, and also to minimize light. These are all challenges for the engineers, but probably ones that considerable progress can be made in. Thank you.
Greetings everyone, I'm Rachel Boschen-Rose, and I'm going to give a very brief overview of the knowledge gaps and priorities for monitoring and research, in particular for the biological environment for the Northern Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So I'd like to start with the Regional Environmental Assessment, which was prepared as a background document for the previous workshop in Evora and also for this workshop. The Regional Environmental Assessment for the biology was broken down into the pelagic and the benthic environment. For the purpose of this document, the pelagic environment is the surface all the way down to 50 meters above the seafloor, and the benthic environment was the seafloor itself and the 50 meters above the seafloor in the water column. There are a number of topics that were covered in the biology and which are listed here, and I've used a traffic light system to indicate which topics were provided with a lot of information and which topics were perhaps not as covered in as much detail. So you can see that for both the pelagic and the benthic environment, a few topics were covered very well and represented by green. The topic that was covered the least for both of these environments was resilience and recovery, with also less content available for connectivity and ecosystem function. And this is important as we move through to some of the discussions at Evora, because this represents that there are potential knowledge gaps in our resilience and recovery sections for both environments. During the Evora workshop, there are a number of discussions into different themes. The first one I've got up here is the adaptive management discussions, and this is particularly for the pelagic biology in this slide here. So the group identified a number of research and monitoring priorities. These are included in this slide. In terms of the monitoring priorities, some of the ones that could be considered moving forwards are looking for changes in the deep scattering layer that are different from the natural environment and sort of the natural changes that would occur there. Changes to the behavior of migratory animals, for example, turtles, seabirds, and whales, and whether they are attracted or indeed avoid the exploitation activities. Any localized responses of midwater nekton, so for example, the squid in this picture, or various fishes and crustaceans, they may be either attracted or indeed avoid some of the exploitation activities. And if you're interested in determining whether there's bioaccumulation or biomagnification of any potential contaminants, then using tissue contaminant levels could be a way to monitor for that. And probably the largest sort of knowledge gap in terms of research priorities is how the pelagic biota respond to noise, light and plumes and other exploitation activities, because this is largely unknown. Staying with the pelagic environment, but moving into the cumulative impact discussions that were held at Evora and also post-Evora through a follow-up working group. A number of research priorities and monitoring priorities again were identified. Priorities here are ones where we would need this sort of information to improve the cumulative impact modelling activities that were undertaken and sort of refine those. In terms of the monitoring priorities, I've listed a few here where ecosystem components were deemed to be likely to have a negative response to various exploitation pressures. So, for example, seabirds in their reaction to surface light, noise, and discharge, whales, dolphins in their reaction to noise and surface discharge, and also midwater necton, again, reactions to noise, light, and the surface discharge. Moving into the benthic environment and the adaptive management discussions, a large number of research priorities were identified for this environment, and some of these are listed here. How these could potentially translate into monitoring priorities could include observing changes in hydrothermal vent communities, so their distribution, the health of those organisms. If there's a change in hydrothermal flow, then you could see a change in the vent community on the seafloor. Changes to inactive habitats, so the hydrothermally inactive sulfide and the organisms that live there. We know very little about the biology of that environment, but if there were changes, that is something that could be monitored. Any changes in vulnerable marine ecosystem indicators, so whether that's species such as different corals or sponges, or habitats such as, for example, hydrothermal vent habitats. Again, whether the health of these organisms changes over time in response to exploitation activities. The distribution of sediment epifauna, such as the acorn worm in the bottom right-hand picture here. So these are surface deposit feeders. They're very important for bioturbation. And if there was a change in their distribution or their behavior as a result of sedimentation from exploitation activities, for example. And again, tissue contaminant levels could also be monitored if you're interested in bioaccumulation or biomagnification effects. Staying with the benthic biology in terms of the group discussions on cumulative impacts, again, various research priorities were identified and how these could translate into monitoring priorities. So some of the ecosystem components that were thought to have a negative response, a particularly negative response to the exploitation pressures, included non-vent invertebrates, and these were deemed to be particularly likely to have negative responses to increases in seafloor turbidity, any potential toxicity and noise, and also the vent invertebrates, which were potentially sensitive to changes in vent fluid supply for the adult organisms, or also introduced turbidity and toxicity from exploitation pressures for the larvae in the water column. So briefly, kind of trying to summarize all this together, there are a number of biological topics where we really don't know an awful lot about what's going on in the northern mid-Atlantic ridge. And I think resilience and recovery is a big knowledge gap, and that's potentially important when we look forward to environmental management. Some of the research priorities could include, an increase in biological baseline information, particularly that's pertinent to resilience and recovery, but also information on mineral exploitation equipment and processes. If we can understand the sort of pressures that we're putting ecosystems under, then interpreting how they might respond to that is easier to do. And monitoring priorities could include the biology components that are most likely to have a negative response to exploitation as potential indicators, and also biological components with a key role in ecosystem structural function. For example, corals and sponges are the home for many other organisms, and damage to those corals or sponges could also lead to negative effects for the organisms that inhabit them. So thank you very much for your time.
Hello, I'm Pat Halpin, and I'm from the Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab at Duke University, and I'm going to be speaking about the knowledge gaps and priorities for area-based management tools specifically. And to organize our thoughts on this, we were thinking about knowledge gaps in terms of the three main approaches we discussed at the Everett meeting. So we discussed vulnerable marine species and ecosystems, important sites and areas, and then representative areas and network criteria. So we felt that it's useful to think about data gaps, knowledge gaps, and new emerging technologies in the terms of these three different approaches. So what could be, what new data could better support the advancement of these three different approaches. In addition, each of these three approaches may have outcomes that were areas or sites in need of protection, or maybe areas or sites in need of precaution. So we're weaving that into this idea as well. So the VME criteria, the vulnerable marine ecosystem criteria, deals with issues specific to a specific species and vulnerabilities. And so these are the criteria here. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but the idea of new data, necessary new data, new knowledge that needs to be acquired can really be thought through the lens of how we think about vulnerability of species, fragility, the growth responses of species. And so this is a very different category of information that is required and would be extremely useful in the future. So some of the things within that category are the identification of additional VME species and occurrences, identification of specific vulnerabilities and responses, identification of vulnerable life history traits, the larval transport, the pelagic larval dispersal, all those kinds of things that would be important for us to think about vulnerable species. And also, we could use significantly more information and data on species occurrence mapping, as well as species distribution models to help support this particular type of area-based management tool. When we're thinking about important sites and areas, there's a different set of criteria, somewhat overlapping, but also thinks about more regional focus in terms of biological productivity, diversity, naturalness. So a lot of more comparative kind of information is required, thinking not just about, is this a vulnerable species, but how does this species or site or habitat representation sit in the entire region? Is it one of the most important places? Is it more natural than other places? Is it more productive than other places? So there's a lot of comparative information that's also required. So here we would need to fill the knowledge gaps on surveys, additional surveys with a variety of ecosystems, increased knowledge and information about distribution models, identifying which species are endemic versus undersampled, community structure information on active and inactive sulfide vent regions, a better understanding of regional patterns of habitat, species distribution, productivity, to understand which sites are truly unique. And so the subtle difference between the VME level of information collection and this level is really putting it into context. Okay, we need to understand the whole region to also be able to say why these sites are especially important within the region. Moving up one more level is thinking about representative areas. And the idea here is to be able to map out representativity, connectivity, replication, and adequacy. These type of criteria require a lot of broad information and require quite a bit of different knowledge. And so these require also a gap analysis as well as a network analysis to really look at whether or not we're actually preserving enough locations to have true connectivity and enough replicates and enough adequacy in our response. So under representativity, we need to have more comprehensive benthic habitat mapping. We need to have much higher resolution bathymetric data and benthic position analysis, topographic analysis, bottom temperature, substrate-dependent biodiversity, depth zonation. This list could go on much longer than this slide. But the idea here is we need to have that broad regional context to be able to say, are we representing enough of this region in the protection network to actually satisfy our criteria? For connectivity, we need to have information on ocean bottom and near bottom currents, potential larval dispersal distances, beta biodiversity at different scales, genetic connectivity, source sink dynamics between populations, and latitudinal distribution of species. This list also could go on, but I think this hopefully gives an idea of the types of directions we're thinking about. For replication, we could really use more information on the sensitivity analysis for locally, regional, and global replication, comparative studies with community structure and related topography. And then for adequacy, we need to have an analysis of the habitat representation within the area-based management tool areas and mining exploration areas, and then the larger RIMP region, as well as an assessment of locally, regionally, and globally rare or unique species. So finally, just a couple of other issues that we feel would be important in the future with area-based management tools is to also start to think of possible conflicts or interactions with other human activities, so fisheries, cable laying, wrecks, other kinds of information that could be of importance within the region. As well as other priorities here, we could be thinking about kind of, these are some top hits that we really think we need. High resolution bathymetry in a comprehensive manner is essential for this type of region. ecological and genetic connectivity data, beta diversity, more realistic hydrodynamic models, of bottom waters, substrata-dependent biodiversity, and depth zonations we think are very, very important. Thank you.